Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today, we are going to be looking at the Red Dawn 2012 timeline by metalheadjohn, who is in the call with us today.
Hello.
We're going to discuss the scenario, discuss what it's based on, the ideas behind it, etc, etc. If you want to read it yourself, we're not going to read it in full, so it's in the description, the DeviantArt link. It's a good read, I would recommend you do it. So to first make clear to the people at home, what are we discussing here? What is Red Dawn 2012? Because I don't think too many people have seen the movie.
Well, that's positive for them. Basically, Red Dawn 2012 is a remake of a 1984 classic Red Dawn where the USSR invades America. Truly a good certified American classic. Definitely great to watch with the boys. It was also made before we realized the Russians were incompetent, but I'll leave that for Hank Hill to explain. Anyways, in 2012, people in Hollywood decided, hey, this movie was very cash money. Let's remake it. So, they decided to remake it, but since Russia was no longer really threatening, they decided, hey, let's use China. They're communist. And then someone came up to our office and said, hey, China actually makes a lot of money for our movies because they have a large potential audience we don't want to alienate. But by the time they were told this, the movie was pretty much done, so they were like, crap, we need another communist Asian power we can hastily replace them with. North Korea. So they hastily replaced every flag with North Korea's and dubbed over the Chinese dialogue with Korean, and next thing you know, North Korea's invading America in a movie that was painful. Yeah, I should say it was painful.
It was just painful.
Yeah, even without the North Korea part, the dialogue was corny and it just didn't have the same charm as the original did. It lacks the neocon charm.
Yeah. But obviously we are alternate historians, so aside from the movie itself being bad, you really cared about the storyline itself, which, as far as the movie goes, it does little to actually explain how North Koreans end up in Spokane fighting against American militias.
Yeah, no one wanted to tackle a timeline of this movie like they did the original, so I did it myself. And frankly, I only had a tiny bit to work with. The most lore we get is the soldier explanation scene and the opening, which is a news montage that doesn't really tell us too much. All we get is that economic issues, Russia is undergoing terrorist attacks. Don't want the montage. Russia is doing shenanigans. And North Korea is being North Korea, and then fast forward to invasion, apparently, because apparently U.S. troops are all overseas, so they can't defend the homeland somehow. That's about all we get. Oh yeah, Russia's invading the other half too. That's mentioned later in the movie, but a lot of people miss that part for some reason. It's almost like they don't want to pay attention to the movie because it sucks.
Yeah, fair. And to be fair, the main focus is on the Western North Korean part, so Russia being forgotten in a movie where they're barely mentioned, all things considered, does make quite a bit of sense. So you set out to actually create a somewhat logical timeline, which led you to making a couple changes immediately in terms of how to even make this happen in a somewhat realistic fashion.
Yeah. Some of it was just working off the implications the movie gave me. Like, it mentioned that North Korea only occupied the Northwest, but it also mentioned that California was occupied too, so someone was invading, but they couldn't mention it because money. So, basically, China is involved, in my version, obviously.
Yeah.
But, maybe Russia invaded both halves, but this is Russia we're talking about.
Honestly, they're already giving Russia a lot of credit here. A simultaneous invasion of California is getting crazy.
Modern Warfare 2 had them invade Alaska, California, and the East Coast. So.
That is true. That is true.
But anyways, the major changes I made have to do with the actual timeline. Specifically, I had them invade in 2020 rather than 2012 because I wanted to give them more than just a year to actually build up the world they invaded in rather than just, current events fast forward.
Yeah. Yeah, because, just imagining an invasion of America in 2012, the Cold War has only been over for 20 years, Russia is still struggling. China isn't even that developed yet. Like, they're getting there, but they're definitely still lagging behind America. So giving them these 8 extra years.
This is also 2012 China, who is not exactly a belligerent power yet, so...
True. Yeah, so that's definitely a good change.
I mean, to be fair, Russia did invade Georgia a few years earlier, so... And if you were old enough to remember at the time, this was seen as somewhat of a big thing, so... At least in the government, so... To be fair, there was reason to believe Russia would be belligerent.
Yeah, I think the Russia part makes sense, but the issue where Russia falls flat in terms of the main antagonist is it's still Russia by 2012. Like, their navy isn't even a tenth of what America is in terms of firepower, etc., etc. So the idea of them as a singular actor with North Korea, but come on, it's North Korea, is that without China, it's a little bit of a loose threat, even if Russia were to go all in. Aside from the nukes, obviously, but you have to take nukes out of account in these kinds of scenarios for the most part, which I believe is the case in most of this script as well.
Yeah, the movie did, so I had to as well, which is funny because the 1980s movie very much did acknowledge the nukes, but...
They just didn't mention them at all, did they?
No, they use non-nuclear missiles exclusively. This is a safe war. Unlike the original war, it's made very clear that nukes were used heavily. Like, the original mentions that the Soviets used nukes and the Cuban infiltrators just shut down ours, so... Somehow.
Oh wow, that is a free... I forgot that about the original, but that is a big hand wave. Like, Cuban infiltrators, they just do it, man.
It's a silly explanation, but it's an explanation that the new movie doesn't have.
That's true. At least they're trying to build a storyline there. We have this larger time frame, and to make this invasion happen, a couple of things occur before 2020 to make the road for China and Russia a bit easier.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, which mainly include, I believe, Europe having an economic depression, which mostly takes them out of the running in terms of supporting America beforehand.
Yeah, this is ripped from the opening, where it's mentioned that Europe is undergoing depression with news headlines talking about Greece being bailed out, which... Yeah, that was a thing back then. A Greek economy. What is that?
Yeah, that was a big thing.
It's also me updating an original storyline. You see, in the original, it's mentioned that West Germany had a Green Party take power, which spreads through west of Western Europe and outright dissolved NATO because they hate nukes. Here, it's updated to be populists, like not even just right-wing or left-wing, just populists in general, who take over and decide they don't want to be enemies with Russia anymore and don't like the U.S. doing shit in Iraq, so they just sit everything out.
Yeah, because that's another big thing. America obviously still goes to Afghanistan, still goes to Iraq. I believe those wars are even slightly worse than in our timeline.
Yeah.
And while this is happening, Russia is also facing some significant issues.
Yeah, funny things happen in Russia. In the opening news monologue, it's mentioned that there's shenanigans going on in Russia. Yeah, thank you, people, for making current events happen. Yeah, stuff happens in Russia that is, according to the news article, 9/11 size, so holy shit.
Yeah, that's big.
Like, in a literal freeze frame, like you don't have to pause the movie to see it, you can see a headline that says ultranationalists seize power in Russia. And then next thing you know, it's mentioned that Russia is outright invading the East Coast. So what I got from this was attacks happen, ultranationalists take power, then we're helping. So I expanded this to be the ultranationalists did a false flag and took over from there.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. So basically by the end of this period, like, let's say just 2019, Europe is mostly populist, isn't really supporting America anymore. America is tired from interventions in the Middle East. Russia is ultranationalist and belligerent. And the Chinese have significantly started their economic rise to be a solid global power, essentially.
Yeah, this is something that was going to be the plot of the original, but was replaced with North Korea. But I'm using it here because China is very much involved. Basically, the U.S. is in a debt issue, and China is demanding they pay. So that's part of the reason they invade.
Oh yeah, yeah. Which I think is not how debt works necessarily, unless America like fully goes bankrupt. But it's an interesting angle.
I may be misremembering here, but I'm pretty sure that's how it went. I think the Russian ultranationalist bit was so they wouldn't have to offend Putin,
Yeah.
who was in the elections at the time, but they're still willing to mention Kim Jong Un, which is funny.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you have angry little great power, which at that angry little power, North Korea, which at that point didn't have nuclear weapons yet, or at that point still mostly respected great power with nuclear capabilities. So it's understandable why China and Russia were more taken care of than North Korea in terms of weaseling them away.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. Who's going to watch it in North Korea anyways?
Yeah, probably only Kim Jong-un himself.
I mean, I doubt. His father, Kim Jong-un, was actually a big movie buff, so
Yeah.
he probably would have watched it, let's be real here.
Which, honestly, pretty hilarious if he actually had. But that leads us to the actual invasion bit, where from, I believe, 3 sides simultaneously, America gets hit by their opponents.
Yeah. So, North Korea, I had to include them because I'm trying to explain the timeline, not fix it. So, they're still invading, but working with the movie, it is somewhat implied that North Korea is to Russia and mystery power number 3. That's totally not, but totally is China. Basically, North Korea is to them what, say, Romania was to the Germans in Barbarossa.
Yeah.
That was the implication I got, and that's what I went with.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Like, have them as, like, nice little frontline troops, have them hold the guards, but the actual big things are for the big players.
Yeah. Correspondingly, they're very rarely mentioned, except for bits involving Korea in this one.
So, as I pull up a map of the actual invasion here real quick. So, within a couple weeks, months, the first period of the invasion, we see the invaders get rather far into America. Care to explain how?
Well, the map is a bit dated, but that is a rough outline of how far they got. It's mentioned that there's a line stretching from like Minnesota to Arizona to I don't know, was it Georgia or Alabama up to Michigan? I don't know. I just know that's a lot of free land, but yeah, basically in the movie it's mentioned they use this EMP thing to shut down all the power because cyber warfare. Then they bomb us with non-nuclear missiles. They explicitly say that. Then they drop troops in to exert pressure. That's what the movie gives us. That's what I worked with. I made mentions of more cyber warfare stuff, combined with disarray at home, and China using its carrier fleet to covertly transport troops to America as well.
Covertly. It's awesome how they cross an entire ocean covertly, but
I mean, they don't suspect anything. They think it's just cargo, not soldiers.
Fair. Oh yeah, that's fair. But even then,
I tried my best.
yeah, true. And I believe you also said like the EMPs shut off communication lines in the Pacific from to America. So even if they had been spotted along the way, communication was difficult in this initial period. Like the cyber attacks was something you really.
They took Hawaii pretty quickly. And I also think I mentioned that they used the U.S. equipment for their own purposes there to explain how they got a bit of a boost.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically things aren't really looking good for America. This initial invasion goes rather well. As you can see, most major cities on the east and west coast have fallen. America is America. We've seen this before in major wars in history, like Operation Barbarossa. The initial invasion was a shock. They got very far. But America is not just going to lay down and take this. So the war goes long, basically.
Yeah, most instances in history where powers get this far is because of audacity alone rather than some sort of great innovation. So once they run out of that, they sort of go on the losing end. A lot of alternate history writers in this universe say they could have won if they just did this, but truth is they just had a good head start.
Yeah, I think in terms of how much space you already gave them, which obviously came mostly from the movie, you can't really push this much further. Like, Russia and China are both fighting a war across an ocean. The initiative factor and the sheer boldness of invading the US mainland gets you quite a couple of points in terms of the big push, but any idea of Russia and China completely occupying America are...
Even then, I make it clear that the Russian and Chinese have no long-term plans to actually occupy America aside from the French ultra-nationalists. Like, it's made clear that the leaders have no plans for long war. We're just sort of hoping that this bold move would cause them to surrender and negotiate immediately.
Yeah, which honestly I think is a pretty fair assessment. Like, it's not like they're only bombarding a couple major cities. Washington, LA, New York, Florida, Boston. It's all taken, which many reasonable powers would at that point go like, hey, fair enough, let's see if we can get a reasonable peace deal out of this. Because I don't even think that the Chinese demands were that heavy. They were mostly economic, right?
Yeah, basically reparations and stay out of our affairs.
Yeah.
Basically, the end goal was to shift the world order to Eurasia rather than away from America.
Yeah. But sadly for China and Russia, and luckily for America, they failed, obviously. And rather than their quick victory, they now actually had to occupy America, which leads to issues for both sides. As I believe, especially Russia is rather, how do you say?
Brutal.
Exactly, rather brutal in their conduct towards the Americans.
Yeah, this is sort of based on actual conduct from current events and past events. Basically, how Russia tends to act in war, combined with how conscript armies tend to act in war. Also, the fact that this is basically taking the whole Red Dawn's neocon propaganda thing to the next level, making them as nasty as possible.
So while Russia is rather brutal in their occupation, China at least tries to keep up a front of not being horrible, like trying to win hearts and minds, you called it. Basically making it seem like, hey, we're here to alleviate your economic issues, build up the nation, etc., etc.
Yeah, attempts to make this bad thing seem like a good thing.
Yeah. But it didn't work, obviously, because one, you're invading America, and two, you're communist. So...
Yeah, you can imagine there was a lot of really sloppy and failed attempts to win over the American people. Probably a lot of use of, like, Chinese social media, too, to spread misinfo.
Yeah.
Like, this is going to be mentioned in the timeline. There's a lot of instances of RT and, I forgot what the Chinese network is, basically on social media spreading news that this city has fallen. They have surrendered an hour ago, when in reality the city is actually doing rather well as a way to encourage them to surrender without fighting. Like, or maybe just showing one video of Chinese troops fighting and saying, this is proof that the city has fallen, even though literally a few minutes later they would be fought back without much issue. There's also just the regular media. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, it's fine. Basically just psychological warfare, especially on the Chinese side, to try to break the American spirit.
Yeah, and then there's the regular media, which is slightly better. That's not propaganda, but not by much, saying a lot of fake stuff like, basically there's a lot of chaos just from the fact that they're invading, and also a lot of fake info like headlines saying that the president is opening negotiations when he isn't. But eventually, as time goes on, the media is reined under control because wartime measures. But in the early days, it's completely chaotic just how the media is out of control and how to spin this. And the Russian and Chinese medias are the worst of it because they're outright propaganda and telling and acting actively malicious and telling them to surrender and such.
Oh my god, literally. Imagine social media during World War II. Oh, that would have been insane. But rather than surrender, all this pressure doesn't break America. The government somewhat reforms itself, flees towards the center of the nation, as you can see on this map. And like we said before, the invasion itself was bold. It got pretty far, but now it has stalled. America isn't really being won over, not even on the Chinese end. Guerrilla warfare starts to set in. The American Navy, which is still more powerful than the Chinese and Russia one, starts to get control over the seas. And basically the invasion force, which wasn't planning for a long war, starts to get into some serious, especially logistical difficulty.
Yeah, Russia basically relied on the fact that Europe would allow them to sail ships through, well, except the UK. And China relied on stealth at first, but with the U.S. Navy active, they struggle because now that stealth is no longer on the table, of course.
Yeah, so slowly but steadily, America starts to get some more initiative back. In this initial, like the first year after the invasion, it's still pretty slow, but hey, it is noticeable. China and Russia desperately try to make peace because they know that they can't really sustain this long-term war anymore.
And of course, the U.S. isn't really going to negotiate at this point.
Yeah, I mean, America is, especially once they get the initiative back on their side, there is little reason for them to negotiate with their invaders. I believe Mexico at some point even somewhat gets involved, or at least their situation gets very intertwined with this war, obviously.
Yeah, Mexico was mentioned in one line in the movie where it said the Texas-Mexico border has been burning for weeks, which I took that to mean there were border incidents that the Russians were screwing with. That or there's a refugee crisis, so I sort of went with both.
Yeah, I think both make sense. Like, basically, Mexico is at the center of like this perfect storm of refugees from both sides, economic interests, the drug trade, China and Russia and America, all three pressuring them to be on their side of the conflict. Mexico would be in chaos, I do think.
At the end of the day, the U.S. sort of offered them an offer they couldn't refuse, and Mexico does benefit from the war a little bit.
Yeah, I believe you mentioned it here that they replaced Chinese manufacturing, which obviously America no longer has access to, and they become like a more industrial economic hub.
That and a combination of refugees bringing money and the U.S. having an active interest in ensuring the border is stable meant there's more cooperation.
Yeah, makes sense. But with all of this in place, Russia and China are struggling. America is on the revival. America even gets a couple of offensives on the Vegas and Eastern Front, while at the same time, Russia and China themselves on their home front aren't really doing too well.
Yeah, Russia is ripped from the headlines pretty much. The ultranationalists are basically sticking their popularity on winning this war, so they're really being hurt by this compared to Korea and China. Also, the whole cutting off the center of the world economy, in fact, has impacts on them in particular.
Exactly. Like, basically, in the case of such an invasion, the entire world starts to enter a serious economic downturn, with China being preoccupied as the second biggest economy in the world, and America losing access to all their ports and also focusing now on the military, on their military and their defense. The economy is going to take a nosedive. Isn't really an issue for America necessarily because they're being invaded, they're in a major war. Not being able to buy another flat screen isn't going to break American spirit at such a time. But for the average Chinese, the average Russian, the question very much would become, why exactly are we doing this? So at that point, Russia and China are both struggling. They're also both already on the defensive on the military front. And then some big uprisings in major cities occur.
Yep, obligatory Warsaw Uprising analogs. But really, this is just to show an idea of what's happening behind the lines, because I don't really go into much detail of that here, aside from when we talk about guerrillas and the pushes.
Yeah, so I believe New York rises up and Russia just completely carpet bombs the city into oblivion.
Much, ruins their image across the world as if it wasn't destroyed already by invading America.
On the Western Front, especially Los Angeles revolts against the Chinese, which leads to China basically dismantling the occupation government they had set up and taking more direct control, and also becoming more brutal in these final years of the conflict.
In the typical way, they blame someone other than themselves for the failure. Oh yeah, while we're here, I want to take a moment to talk about the name of a Russian-Chinese alliance, the Pacific Rim Cooperation Organization.
Yeah.
This is taken directly from the movie where it's mentioned that North Korea joins Russia, but the other countries in this Pacific Rim Cooperation Organization are the Central Asian Stan nations who aren't touching the Pacific at all. So why is it called the Pacific Rim Cooperation Organization if two countries in it have Pacific borders while the other four do not? It's a stupid name, but it's what I had to work with.
Yeah,
Moving on.
it's
Sorry, I had
fair.
to go off
I
on
mean,
that tangent.
technically, I guess you could have a similar complaint about NATO, but even then, it is more significant here because, like you said, 2 out of the 6 nations touch the Pacific, and that's
And
it.
before North Korea, it was only one of the 5 nations.
Yeah, because I believe it's Russia, China.
It's Russia and the
Nordic.
stands. China wasn't officially a member.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's
In
true.
the movie,
It
at
wasn't
least.
Russia. It wasn't China. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, in the movie it couldn't be China.
It's almost like the stand nations are just appendages of Russia and don't have much autonomy to begin with. Like, the whole reason the Russians just call that is just a dab on the stands.
Yeah.
Just assert dominance. But Russia, we don't touch the Pacific. And it's like, oh, but you do. Through me, you do.
We touch the Pacific. So, by this point, America starts to really get their, get their mojo back. Basically, between 2023 and 2025, slowly but steadily push the Russians out of the east and the Chinese out of the west. By this point, it is still a long and difficult struggle, but there is not really any chance of Russia or China seriously coming back from this. Like, everyone knows America is going to win. It's just a matter of how long can they resist.
Yeah, pretty much. This is not too different from World War II, to be honest. Let's be real here. Every war is World War II.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so America disrupts the EMPs, which were disrupting their electricity and their signals. They get air control back. It's basically over.
Yeah, communications are back. They can talk to their fleet people again.
Yeah, which is pretty nice. Importantly as well, Europe decides to finally get involved 5 years into the conflict. Good job, guys. Which obviously puts major strain on Russia, which now, aside from fighting a war a continent away, which they cannot supply anymore, they're also threatened on their home front.
Ukraine falls into civil war too, because in this timeline there's no Euromaidan.
Yeah, so basically Russia is collapsing more and more towards the end of this conflict, while China, after decisively losing on the Western Front, America demands unconditional surrender from them.
Yeah, that I think that leads to the coup. Let me look through it. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it leads to the Wolf Wars attempting a coup to hold on to power, but that fails. Also, Tibet and Xinjiang rise up.
Yeah, exactly. There was Hong Kong as well. Basically, the situation in China just really starts to deteriorate. Yeah, Japan gets involved. America has reclaimed their west coast. Their navy can get operational in the Pacific. Basically, China realizes the war is coming their way. So the trust in the leading people is basically gone at this point.
Yeah, the Chinese have the luck of being able to maintain power, unlike the Russian ultranationalists.
Yeah, Russia basically collapses into full-scale civil war, while in China, the leading wolf warriors step down, I believe. But the CCP itself, remains the sole authority in China, basically.
Yeah, the people sort of rise up to see him removed, but after it's made clear that they don't want the CCP gone, just this faction, they still support the Communist Party. They basically get supported by much of the military as a result.
Yeah, and America, I think, isn't really up for a counter-invasion of China at this point, which makes sense. So America has won. Russia is basically no more. But China seems to have gotten off pretty lightly. Like, in terms of demands that America made of them, was there anything really significant?
Yeah, there really wasn't much demands aside from reparations, because at the end of the day, breaking up China or making extreme demands would have affected the economy too much at a time where the U.S. needed stability to come back. So really it was reparations and a few other demands that I will elaborate on in the full timeline. Like, basically, one of them, I think, is Chinese acknowledgement of certain events. Like, I think I had mentioned that the CCP had to acknowledge that Tiananmen happened, or else the U.S. would keep going.
Honestly, yeah, that is a pretty good thing. like just a small symbolic gesture, but uh, at least it gives something.
Rather than demand free and fair elections, the U.S. would embarrass the Chinese Communist Party by forcing them to admit that they made mistakes in the past and did crimes, so that their people would have even less trust in them.
Yeah, because basically, in my mind, like, America is also exhausted, obviously. It has been 5 years of war. Yes, they can now decide on a full-scale blockade of China, but if China really wants to continue the fighting, they can, basically. They're still a nation of 4 billion people. America isn't launching a counter-invasion. A long and drawn-out blockade and bombing campaign would take billions, which America would really rather invest in rebuilding, I think. So it makes sense that China got off this light.
And of course, it seems small, but to the Chinese Communist Party's pride, it's huge.
Yeah, true.
Like, just having to acknowledge that Taiwan is an independent nation would be a big blow to their prestige, even if they do seem to be gaining off light on paper.
Yeah, I think it strikes a nice balance between China doesn't get off without any repercussions, but also America doesn't push for too much. Russia would probably have gotten a similar deal if they didn't just fully collapse in on themselves during the same time.
Yeah, this also essentially plants the seeds for Tibet and Xinjiang to rise up again, because now that China's being forced to admit its mistakes, people are more likely to try and go for actual independence in the future now.
Which makes sense. Then, as a minor point, while this was all going down, India and Pakistan had their own issues, you can say.
Yeah, India gets fucked up bad in this one temporarily, but they do get better after a decade. This is a update of the original. The original it's heavily implied that the USSR glassed China to keep them from being a threat, which is holy shit. So
whoa.
This is the modernized version of China doing the same thing to prevent India from being a threat while they do their business in America.
Yeah, so India and Pakistan just launch nuclear attacks on India to make sure that India doesn't attack China while their army is over in California.
Yeah, naturally, you can imagine that Indians think that China got off light after the war.
Yeah.
And of course, they nuke Pakistan in response, and Pakistan does even worse than India as a result.
Yeah, and India also fires back against China at some point. Like, it's not like they just lay down after the nuclear strike fully.
Yeah, it's just most of their nukes are focused on either countering Pakistan, going at Pakistan, but the rest go at China, are intercepted, unfortunately.
Then we have, towards the end of the war, North Korea doesn't necessarily surrender with Russia and China, and Iran is also still doing some things in the Middle East.
Yeah, have to get all the big neocon big bads, and of course Iran's gonna have some fun. Yeah, basically Iran and North Korea try to use loopholes to avoid having to pay and surrender.
Yeah, because Iran is invading Iraq and I believe Saudi Arabia as well, right?
Their one atomic bomb on Riyadh, which immediately alienated everyone.
Yeah. So by the end of the war, America, Israel, and Turkey invade Iraq and Iran again, and Tehran would eventually mostly surrender, becoming a pariah in the region because they nuked Riyadh, obviously.
Yeah, they do sort of surrender, but at the end of the day, they still have their regime in power. Yeah, they tried to say they weren't a part of the Pacific Rim Cooperation Organization, so therefore the armistice didn't apply to them. While North Korea tried to say it only applied to the American front so they could keep South Korea.
Yeah. So North Korea was eventually pushed back from South Korea as well, or am I misremembering that?
Yeah, they're pushed back from South Korea and eventually come to terms when they realize that the Chinese aren't going to move in to help them because the Chinese agreed not to fight anymore.
Yeah, but America doesn't pursue them into the north.
Yeah, there's also the issue of the fact that North Korea was holding hostages, which were part of the reason they kept going was because, invading South Korea and holding American POWs in Pyongyang as sort of human shields in case we tried to bomb them. Like basically, it's
Yeah.
gonna mention a timeline, but there's famous videos of Kim Jong Un inviting prisoners from America to his palace and doing photo ops with them to make it seem like he's being nice, while also subtly saying, "Hey, you blow me up, you're blowing them up too."
Yeah, which it
It's
makes
actually what
sense.
Saddam did during the Gulf War. That's what's a reference to.
But with that, we have mostly covered the timeline. By the end, you tease that in 2044, the Third Korean War will begin.
This is actually going to be covered in the full timeline. I'm not going to spoil too much here because I'm still working out the details, but yeah, stay tuned.
Stay tuned. And follow Metalhead John on DeviantArt. Link below.
Yeah, TLDR, Korea's gonna do more shenanigans. China is gonna not stand by because they have their own issues, and hijinks ensue.
But with that, I think we have covered everything. Do you have anything you want to mention? Anything we forgot?
Well, I don't want to give too much away. A lot of my commentary I didn't say is covered in the footnotes of the actual scenario, and a lot more will be covered in the full timeline.
True.
Once I get over my writer's block and finish my secret project. I'll be sure to link the Space Battles link in the server once I actually get started.
Smart. Yeah, so with that, if you want to read the full timeline as it stands right now, because a new version is being worked on, check the link in the description below. You can read the entire thing. There's a lot we skipped, especially in terms of details. And with that, I would like to thank you, Metalhead John, for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
And to the people at home, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.